The water sector, if you compare it to the energy sector, it lags by 7 years. It will take the water sector today 7 years, assuming the energy utilities stop their digitization as they are now. It will take it 7 years to catch up with it.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm curious to have yet another discussion with someone from Science Water because I'm still trying to put my finger on what's special about Science Water. If I'm right, you're working on the research part of the company. So what are you exactly looking into?
First, thank you for having me. Of course, would love to talk more about what I do, like anyone else. So basically, to your point, I do the research part, but also more of an actionable research, not just a research that ends up in a drawer. Based on my research and the team's research, we find emerging trends, challenges within the water, and we address these challenges with investments, with finding the right companies or technologies to address these challenges. For example, maybe to make this more concrete, I can talk about our effort in the digitization of water and wastewater utilities. Our portfolio companies work in the water sector at different levels and across the value chain. But one of them is a water and wastewater utilities company where they own water systems across the US. Looking at that specific segment, which is the water operation and the municipal water cycle from the source until the end user, we saw a huge opportunity in digitizing this value chain. Maybe as a key stat to give you a sense about the digitization level of the water sector, if you compare it to the energy sector, it lags by 7 years. To paraphrase this one is basically it will take the water sector today 7 years, assuming the energy utilities stop their digitization as they are now. It will take it 7 years to catch up with it. So imagine how this gap is widening, and this is just to give you a sense of how late the water sector in adopting new technologies, as simple as smart metering. And this is just something that you can see and sense, but also goes into the operation and processes of the actual plant. My point is that we saw this challenge, that how can these utilities become more digital? And by doing that, helps utilities become more efficient, optimize operation, optimize resources, both human and financial, etc. And there's a lot of opportunities to realize the impact, obviously, because now you can quantify it, you can also mitigate some environmental risks, etc. What I was trying to say is that we look for challenges among the companies we own, and we develop the capabilities to address them. And the digitization challenge is one thing that we're working on now.
So digitization is a challenge because we are late as a sector compared to the energy, okay? But beyond that, why is it a challenge? Why do we need digitization? I'm playing the devil's advocate, sorry. But
No, that's a fair point, because this is the question we're asked every time we try to sell a technology or convince an operator to adopt a new technology. Why do we need it as long as it's working now? Well, I'll give you another example to simplify it. When you own a water system, you have some assets that are within the fence or inside the fence, but also you have assets that are outside the fence, that are sometimes tens or 100 miles away from the main plant. So for example, without a technology, you would need, and these assets are various. You have lift stations, pump station, manholes, fire hydrants, and you need to make sure they're working. You need to make sure if there's an issue, if there's flooding or anything, you need to keep track of all these assets. 20 years ago, how do you keep track of these assets? What you do is you have to send someone driving their truck and check if the lift station is actually working, or there's a light or an alarm, so they drive by it and they see if the alarm is on, then there's an issue. Nowadays, you can do this with just looking at your phone and checking whether the sensors that are attached to this lift station, whether it's working or not. For example, with this simple technology, which is the technical name is the remote SCADA, or the remote monitoring of these remote assets, you would think every utility has it. But in reality, there are some utilities today still using a technology that's called auto dialers, which is basically when something goes wrong with your lift station, there's like a connected to the towers and the Ethernet to calls your phone. In 21st century, this, you would think this technology is like kind of like outdated, but still people are using it. So for us, this is how we sell it to the customers. Like we give them an example. We tell them, okay, how do you do this job? Let's give you a pilot. Let's try a pilot and like tell us how is your life afterwards. This is how we can attack it from like a need and a necessity than kind of just like, oh, because it's like fancier to have like this dashboard where you look at all the numbers. So it's like addressing a certain need.
Once you've identified that need and you want to address it, how do you address it? What's your vehicle for impact?
This is where it comes kind of like our portfolio companies. Now we have a platform, a digital water platform, where it's focused at finding these technologies that the water sector needs them, and then introducing these technologies to them from the pain point. And we do this through our extensive network of like companies and distribution networks throughout the US. And by actually talking to the operators, understanding their issues, inviting them over, having them kind of like learn more about the technology, and like slowly have them kind of like adopt these technologies. And what we see, like we start with like some systems that are 30, 50 lift stations, each would require sensoring, etc. Usually they start with one. We don't have a problem. It takes them probably like a couple of months, if not a year, to adopt one or two. But then later, you see them kind of like asking for more and more. And it, just like you see the curve kind of like upward trending, but it happens with every customer. But then the good thing is like, because of how the water sector is structured, it's very local, and people need to kind of like see it before they kind of actually adopt it. So by having a technology introduced into a certain community, after some time, we start seeing other customers kind of coming because they saw their neighbors is actually using his phone to check the performance of his assets. So there's like kind of like the word of mouth, but also being close to your customers, listening to them and understanding their concerns. No one is going to go to Amazon and like buy the latest sensoring technology, even if it's like way cheaper and it's like way accessible because it can't get to your door. People need to like trust you, need to like see it. There is a kind of like natural cycle to adopting a technology.
Can you take us a bit behind the scenes to understand how you run your research? Because what you're hinting to sounds like something we experience out there in the field, that digitization is late in the sector, that it covers a lot of needs, that if you want to go distribute it, you need something to power it, and digitization will be that vehicle to power it. But beyond this kind of good sense, common sense, which are the facts you're building on to identify a trend?
That's a good question, which I basically kind of, this is the first question I asked myself. How can I do it when I was first assigned this task of building our digital platform and like doing the research? I mean, starting with kind of like top down, what are the research out there? What are the challenges that the water sector is facing? And kind of like this is the macro view, which basically everyone knows. You can find it in Google. It's just like accessible, easy to find, easy to do, but you need to structure it, clean it. And then the next kind of like step, which many people kind of struggles, actually going and like talking to the people, understanding from the people who are on the ground, how do they perceive these things. Countless times when doing the desktop research, I find these technologies that I think are just like mind-blowing. Like, wow, this technology can actually tells you, for example, like where's your leak detection exactly. Like this technology can do this. This is like a no-brainer. Like, of course, every utility is like gonna jump over it and like adopt it. And then you go and talk actually to the operators and like understand their concerns, understand their challenges, their resource limitation, budget limitation. Then you kind of like recalibrate kind of like your sense of like these technologies. That's why you're working as a technology provider, as like someone who's like introducing or investing in new technologies. Sometimes I see like there's a mismatch between what's needed and what's being offered. And to answer your questions, through our portfolio companies, because we have direct access to them. They are like on the first line. We get like all kind of insights and first-hand experience of like what will work, what's not gonna work, and also especially through CSWR, since they're kind of like the case in point here, they experience all these different challenges.
To round off that conversation, I'd like to have a crystal ball question. You're looking at the trends, you're looking at how to action the trends, but do you have a KPI which tells you that you had actually an impact on a 5 or 10 years outlook?
We're now in the process of kind of like developing our KPIs across the portfolio to quantify this. But I think one of the tangible impact we see, and like we hear this from our customers, is that you go and like introduce the technology of like, let's say, remote monitoring into like a certain utility, but then you hear back is like, oh, actually now we're attracting younger generation because the perception of operating a utility and like not necessarily like tech savvy, but like no, we're actually giving you the opportunity to use technology, utilize technology to make your life easier. So then we see, because we offer also like customization and like different kind of like services, we see customers coming to us saying, okay, so can you add, for example, different kind of sensors, or can you add, like, for example, we have this customer, they monitor tank level, which is like basic, you find it everywhere, but then they realize the value of like censoring, the value of like monitoring, the value of data. They were like, okay, so we have issues with the tank maintenance and how sometimes there are cracks, there are leaks that we didn't know about until after it happens. So how can we solve it with this technology? For example, like working with like technologies that address emerging issues that are not like, if you go on like Google sensor to help me with the tank cracks, it's not there, you know? We work with our customers to develop the next gen technologies to help them address their issues. So to your question, how do we know whether the impact is there or not, is by them kind of reacting and like even like wanting more, to adopt even more. So this is something, you know, positive, and we hope to see at some point that the water sector is like caught up with like the other industries and even further.
To round off these interviews, I have a couple of rapid fire questions. So it's short questions, I mean to short answers, but I'm never cutting the microphone. The first one is, what is the most exciting project you've been working on and why?
Talked a lot about digitization, but I think helping water and wastewater utilities to become more digital and to bring more talents into the water sector where they can like have impact through digitization and working in technology. And this is, I think, is very exciting and also kind of like good energy.
What is the one single thing which you're doing today in your job which you will not be doing in 10 years?
I think it's kind of like explaining to people why water like matter. Hopefully in 10 years, you know, people will get like why water is like something essential, and not just like the water we drink, but also it's like the water infrastructure and everything around it.
I would love that you're fully right here. I just fear we might have to still explain it in 10 years. But fingers crossed. And last question for me, what is the trend to watch out for in the water sector, which is not digitization?
One trend that we see it like happening in the water sector, which is kind of not digitization, but also has to do with technology, which is like cybersecurity, and how now the threat of cybersecurity is very understated, but also very significant in terms of like the threat and the risk it poses to water systems and like utilities, but also it's like a national risk. So I think more focus in terms of like from the different stakeholders is something we're gonna see emerging, and it's an opportunity for small companies, operators, and everyone is like to start ahead of the game.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for sharing these insights, this behind the scenes, and I'll let you have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This is it for another episode of the Don't Wastewater podcast. I'd like to hand out a special thanks to Sciens Water for enabling it, and if you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. I don't know if I deserve 5 stars, but my guest surely does. Do it now, tell it to your friends, and I'll be back very soon with the next interview.